Hi guys, and welcome to part 2 on this Ford Anglia 105E respray that we're doing. So in part 1, if you tuned in for that, we went through all the repair work and the actual primer stage in as much detail as we could. Now in part 2 we're going to go through the actual paint prep side of things, blocking this car out using some guide coat, and later in the video we're going to get through to the masking and some wet on wet primer. So the way that we went about this, as you'll know from part 1, is we put a good few coats of high build primer on this. We are now going to put on some of the Indasa dry guide coat that you saw us using on the repair stage of this, and we're going to give that a real good spread around and get a real good coverage over this boot panel. Now you will notice just to the left that the actual Anglia itself is already painted. Unfortunately, as I said in part 1, we did actually lose some of the footage, so I had to re-record this on some of the panel work. Now one of the biggest things with guide coat is just trying to make sure you've got good coverage over the whole panel. Now you don't have to have this panel really absolutely solid in guide coat, you just want a nice film over that whole panel and over that whole surface, so that when we can start blocking this down, we've got something nice that we can see any little imperfections, any lows or anything like that as we're going through the blocking process on the panel. Now for actual sanding pads for this, we're using the long bed sanding disc and we're using a P4 240 on a medium block. It's a nice sort of size for a panel like this. It's got a few shapes in it. Yes, we could go for the longer block that we got, but for a panel like this it's got a lot of shape, there's not really much need. A medium sized block like this gives us a bit more control over the areas that we're working, and as long as we keep a nice motion and follow all the contours and the shapes of the panel as we're blocking this out, we shouldn't have end up with really much of a problem with actually blocking it out. It's just really is a case of trying to make sure you take your time with things, and as we said with the repair stage in part 1, the actual guide coat itself really does help with pointing out any little highs or lows. You can just see there's a tiny bit of a low spot in this panel there. Now with the amount of build we've got of primer on here, we can afford to block out quite a lot of this primer and still end up with a really good prime surface at the end of it. Yes, there is always the risk that you'll break through on any little edges when you're trying to block out a nice big flat panel like this, but that's why we're going to get onto a bit of wet on wet stage later in the video, after we've been through the actual masking stage, and a few tips on masking that have been asked before about how we mask off window openings and door openings and stuff like that. But back to the job in hand, we really are just going to keep a nice even block across this whole panel. Now there's not really much of a trick to it, you just want to try and keep nice and flat and a nice even pressure on your block. Don't rush any part of it, and just take your time more than anything, making sure that you're blocking the whole panel out evenly and not concentrating on one particular tiny little area for too long. Now where we had that little low spot, you will notice in a second that I've moved back and forth over that spot, the same as I'm moving from side to side, front to back over this area, and you can see any of them little low areas or any of them little areas that may have looked low gradually are working themselves out in the build that we've put on the primer. I'd say probably one of the other main things you want to make sure is as well that don't prime all your panels up and then come to them the next day and then start blocking them straight out either. You need to give your panels a good bit of time, especially if you've got ambient temperature like we have. Make sure your primer and everything's mixed bang on to the to the manufacturer's data sheets and everything like that, and then give your primer, I like to try and leave it about 4 to 5 days if you've got this kind of build. It gives you a lot less chance of getting any shrink back or anything like that from where your repaired areas are, or even any little rub throughs that you've had underneath this primer. You want this primer really to be rock solid before we start blocking it, because if it's not rock solid when we start blocking it, one, it's going to start clogging a sanding disc up and it's going to mean a lot of materials wastage, and two, you're not going to be able to block this out and get a true flat form to your panel, because as this dries out the paint's going to shrink down and it's going to lose some of its film build, and then it's going to start sinking in more into any of them lows and into any of them repaired areas. Now on this corner here you'll see a band of low spots start appearing. Now in the 60s when this car was made, they weren't quite as fussy about panel pressing marks and things like that, and this little area here we can actually see these indents are where the original pressing marks from the panel would have been on this panel. And again, if you just keep working in a nice even motion, these pressing marks are only really shallow, and although at the moment they stand out and they look horrendous just because of the black guide coat's in there, and that stands out so much against this grey, a nice light even block, you can see them gradually disappearing. Now another area to be extra careful on is on swage lines and panel edges and things like this, especially where your panels have got a bit of shape. You want to try your best to try and be a lot more controlled. Don't go really harshly right up against these edges, because the chances are that with having a bit of a build of paint there, even if it's only a small amount of build of paint like you would have had when we originally started doing this panel, that if your sandpaper is overhanging your block at all, then you can quite easily cut lines into the vertical faces of those swage lines, or you can get rid of the shape off these lines altogether. So it is really important that when you're working around any of these type panel edges or swage lines, that you be extra careful in how you're blocking up to them and how much you're blocking against them. What I tend to try and do is try and get close. You can see here I'm just checking my block just to see whereabouts my sandpaper is actually sitting on the block before I start blocking out. Now going across those edges, especially on this piece here, I noticed I have got a little bit of a pinhole. That's not an issue, it's not something to worry about. At this point you can pop a bit of fine filler in there, re-block over that with a 180, then a 240, and then finish off with a DA like we shall in a minute. But back to this edge, I am just working up that edge really gently and really carefully and trying the best as I can to be as accurate as I can. Now I won't work that edge much more than that. I'll block it out as close as I can get it up to a point where I feel comfortable, and then any edges and tight spots like that, I'd rather finish that off with a disc or with a soft back sanding sponge by hand, just to be extra careful that I don't actually damage the shape of that swage line in the boot. And especially on an old car like this, you know, all these little swage lines and all these panel lines and everything, you know, on an old car like this, they are a lot of character of the car, so you want to make sure that you take your time to preserve all those edges and sharpen and crisp them up as and where you can, just to make sure that this car does keep all its original character and all its original shape, whilst flattening it out and making it more of a concourse finish than the factory did. Now for the final stage, we've blocked all that boot out now, and for final finishing now before paint, what I've done is I've put a P500 on the DA, which for a 2K direct gloss like we're going to be using on this is more than good enough finish to be painting on top of. You could go to 600 if you wanted, but because I've used the 240 to block this out, a P500 is going to be that little bit quicker and that little bit easier to make sure we sand all those P240 scratches out of the actual primer surface, which is what we're doing now. Now we have got the interface pad on the DA as well, just to make sure that we're not digging in anywhere and we're not putting any flat spots into this panel. Bearing in mind we've just tried to block this out to make sure that the actual finish is nice and even and a lot smoother than it would have been originally. And you want to pretty much try and keep the same sort of motion with your sander as what you were doing with the block. You want to keep things nice and even. You don't want to stay in one spot for too long. You know, keep your sander moving up and down, follow the contours of the panel. And all this stage really is doing is we are just making sure we've taken all those 240 scratches out of this panel. And again, don't worry too much if you do break through a tiny bit on any of your edges anywhere, because we can wet and wet prime them in a bit when we've got it in the booth, which again, that's the stage that we're going through at the end of the video. So as I said, harsh little panel lines and harsh little swage lines like this aren't something that I want to get a block up against, because I don't want to cut into them in a way that's going to take the shape out of them and then make something like this boot look off from the rest of the car once it's been sanded up and once it's been in the booth, and add some gloss on it. Because once you get the gloss on this, if there's a tiny bit, maybe where the edge of your sandpaper sheet's cut into that swage line on the vertical face, it's going to stand up as a big harsh line where it's cut into it. So my way of doing it, some of you guys might have a different way, but I like to get the sanding disc by hand and go around any little panel edges and just finish them up. Now obviously we're now about 10.5, 11 minutes into this video, and we're still prepping one boot, and I have cut out a lot of the footage. Now to do this over a whole car does take a lot of time and a lot of effort, but the final result you'll get from doing this kind of work over a car like this and going over every inch of the car like this will set your car apart from one that you've just primed and then given a quick sand to one that you've actually spent hours and hours blocking out by hand, making sure that all these panels are flat. And we did literally go over every single inch of this car on the exterior to make sure that when this is done and when the paint goes down, that it has got the best finish possible that we can give it for the sort of job that we're doing on this car. And as I say there, every inch of this car is getting the exact same prep, and it is time consuming, but the most important thing, if you take anything away from this, is the fact that preparation, no matter whether it be in your filler stage or your first sanding stage, when you're first prepping to actually put your filler on, your pre-paint prep, down to your prep in the booth, your tack rags, your masking stage, every little bit of it all amounts up to having a really nice, clean, pristine job at the end of what is, you know, a long amount of hours worth of work that we do spend on these cars. A lot of customers don't see all the work that we actually put into these cars and all the time and effort it takes to actually give the finish and the look that they want on their cars. But you know, if you've done it right, the feeling at the end of it when you see it back in one piece is brilliant. And for me, that's one of the biggest things about this job, is being able to take a car like this that was built in the 1960s and give it such a brand new, fresh, clean look and end up with a happy customer at the end of it. So we've prepped the rest of the car up, all the prep's finished, the car's been cleaned down, it's had a panel wipe and a blow off, and we've cleaned everything down as much as we can. We've done a few tiny little bits of fine filler on this, and we have got the odd little rub through. Now we'll go through them towards the end of the video, where we're actually going to go through a full bit of a wet and wet primer tutorial on this car to show you how we're going to go about that. And also we've got all the doors and everything else off now. Now there's my little helper for the day. My daughter came down to the shop this day, wanted to come down and see a bit of what Daddy was doing, so she was about to help for the masking stage on this car, which was quite nice to get to spend a bit of a time with her at the shop as well. Now you will notice that the engine bay, we're not painting the engine bay, we're back masking that off. The actual door shuts that we didn't prime up originally, and you can see around the actual window edge there, we'll be wet and wet priming them to make sure that when we're done, this has got a full nice sealed coat of primer before we put our direct gloss over it. Now there are a lot of ways of masking windows and door shuts off. Some people prefer poly, some like brown paper, and it's down to personal choice. When I'm doing a respray like this, although it does take a little bit of a longer time, I do prefer using paper. I can't really give you a reason why. I prefer the look of it when we first do it. It looks really nice and neat when it's in the booth, which is probably a daft reason to like it, but hey, each to their own. And also when this car comes out, all I'll be doing is removing the masking from one of the door shuts, and I'll actually leave the rest of the car fully masked with all these over the windows and the doors and everything while I flat and polish this car out. And that'll give me a bit more protection and something that's a little bit stronger than poly, which you can quite easily rip. That while I'm doing the polishing stage, none of that polish and none of that compound and that mess is going to get inside this car, because the last thing that I want to do is make a mess of the interior or anything on this car, because obviously being a 1960s car, it's not something that parts would be easy to get or easy to replace. Now this is one thing I've been asked a few times about masking windows up. I will back mask from the inside face, and it's always good to try and panel wipe the inside of that painted face first, and then I'll use a lattice pattern across the actual window like so. What that'll give me is when I stick a little bit of this paper down, and obviously if we're using something like the SATA that's running at 2 bar, as soon as you get 2 bar of air pressure across a gap like that, if you haven't got that little bit of extra strength, sometimes your paper can bow quite a bit and take quite a hit off the air, and sometimes the masking can come off a little tiny bit at the edges. And the same with poly, sometimes poly can hold a little bit of dust and a little bit of overspray, and the less that your paper or your poly is flapping around and moving, when it's masked inside there, the better. And there's less chance of any dust coming off it or anything like that, and there's less chance of your air pressure from your gun or even your airline when you prep this up before you put your colour down with your tack rag actually breaking any of the seal on that masking. Another good tip is whenever you're doing any masking like this, make sure you've got a really nice sharp single edge razor blade to hand, because the last thing that you want to do is have a dull one and spend ages hacking away at the paper. There's a lot more risk if you're hacking away at it that you can slip and possibly catch that prime surface that you've already prepped up really nice, which is the last thing that you want to be doing on a car like this, that you spent this kind of hours getting prepped up. All these hours of prep are probably going to amount to about 2.5–3 hours in the booth getting this car painted, which is a shame sometimes, because like most painters I prefer to be in the booth spraying, but you know, you have to put in the hard work to get the enjoyable work from this job. Now, this method I've used here, you can use across the windows, across door shuts, use it in the windscreen openings. On a lot of cars you can use it in the boot openings as well. And it is a good effective way of masking up. What I always do like to do is just to double mask around these edges, just to make sure that the seal from that first piece of tape and the paper is 100%, just to make sure that no air or overspray leaks through that gap anywhere. And as you can see there, that actual exterior lip around that window where the rubber would usually fit, we can now get in all those areas nice and cleanly and with ease, to make sure that edge to edge now this paint job will be seamless across the inside the door shuts and the inside the windows and everywhere else, which is going to, when it's done, it's going to give that really nice clean edge to it all. So around all that gap we can get in nicely and we can end up with no issues with anything. And the fact that we didn't prime it in the first place isn't too much of an issue, because we can wet on wet in a second. Now, the boot itself, some of you guys, this might look like a bit of a strange way of masking this boot up, but it has got that very tight back window. And it's another thing, when you're masking up, you really need to think about where you need to get your gun when you're painting, when you're actually spraying the car. If you mask this up straight across front to back and back mask this off like a normal boot, the issue that I'd have is that I won't be able to spray underneath that lip in a moment, that I'll show you in a moment. Now, all we did was just drop a piece of the 18-inch paper in a bit of a skirt around the outside, put this flat piece in the bottom of the boot, and then just mask that all around that paper. That then gives me a lot more area for my arm to actually reach. You can see that edge under there. I can reach that really easily there. I can get all the sides of the boot edges and everything like that with no problem. If I masked it across here, the problem is, when I came to spray underneath that back window, I won't be able to get my elbow and my arm there and get the gun in there with enough room. Now, I'm going to leave you with the wet on wet stage now, guys, and I'll see you in a minute. So that's just about it for the actual first coat that we put on here, and you will notice I am putting it on really fine and really light. The one thing that we don't want to get now is any problems in this wet on wet. If we get any dust or dirt or anything in the paint, maybe because we haven't filtered the primer out properly, or if we get any runs or anything like that, the problem is that we're going to get this stage is that we're either going to have to let the car fully cure through and then sand these areas to make sure that we can get a run out or anything like that, or we're going to have to risk it coming up and showing up in the actual final job itself. So I found the best way is just to over reduce your primer till you've got a nice wet on wet primer to use, and then go around and just all these little rub throughs and these little bits that could cause us problems, all those little bits where we put the fine filler on, we are just going to put down 2 really light coats and then let that fully flash off for around about 15-20 minutes. If it's a cold day you can leave it a bit longer. The one thing I probably wouldn't recommend is leaving it overnight, as leaving it that amount of time could cause you adhesion problems in the future. Now I've used this one a few times and I've done it anything from about 15 minutes to half an hour, and we've had no issues with it whatsoever when we've done it. So I can say that it is quite a good primer to use for these little wet on wet bits. And in part 1 you'll notice that obviously we didn't put the build coats over the door jambs, because like I said before, a lot of this car is in absolutely mint condition and the door jambs were definitely one of those parts. So what I did was I prepped these door jambs up with a P500, now 2 nice light coats of these to get rid of any little rub throughs and just to make sure that these areas are really nice and clean and everything's fresh, ready to take our gloss is more than enough. And for the same around these little window edges, you know, they don't need that massive build of primer because we're not going to be blocking areas like that out. We wanted that build over the outside of the car more than anything. The other thing with over reducing the primer, that's one reason why we're going for around about 30-40% primer and then doing it in 2 nice light coats. These coats will be really fine, they will dry into the surface a bit like a base coat going on top, so there's going to be no build there that's going to stand high or that's going to stick up anywhere. Another thing to make sure is, obviously from what you can see here, is that you've done all your masking properly. You've back masked off any little holes and any little bits and pieces like that. With the underside of this car being immaculate, we did actually back mask the whole underside of the car off to the floor as well, and that will also help you out that little bit with dust, and at the end of it gives you that cleaner job that you can be that little bit more proud of. Now another thing to make sure is that before you put this car in the booth and also before you start putting the wet on is that you prep this car as if you were putting the gloss down on this car. If this wet on wet goes down and it's got any dirt or dust or debris in the paint at all, maybe because you haven't filled it out properly or because you've scrimped on a bit of prep because you're thinking, oh, I'm just chucking a quick bit of primer down here, the problem that you're going to run into is that those bits are going to show in the final gloss, and that's not something that we want in the future, because any big underlying problems in our final finish is going to cause us problems and we're going to end up doing a lot of rework, or we could end up having to try and block them out and a lot of messing around, which if this stage is done right, which is an easy enough stage to do, then we're going to end up with a really nice clean job at the end of it. So I hope you guys have enjoyed this video. Again, a little bit longer than we've been used to in previous videos, but you guys have been asking and we've had a lot of great feedback saying that you guys really liked the first part on this, that it was a little bit longer and that we changed things up a bit. We were trying to change the editing style around a bit, trying to make things a little bit more watchable for you guys, and hopefully you guys are enjoying it. We've had a lot of new subscribers this past week or so, so thanks to all you guys. If you're new to the channel, don't forget, hit that subscribe button, and if you found something useful in this video, don't forget to hit the like and give it a like, so that other people can see that obviously it's informative and that it's a good watchable video that they can get something out of as well. Now we're going to leave part 2 here, and in part 3 we're going to get into the main actual paintwork stage on this car, and we're probably going to finish up on part 4 where we'll probably go through a little bit of the flat and polishing work and also get a good video and some good shots of this car rebuilt and ready to go as it was when it went out. So I hope you guys have enjoyed this. For all you guys that have been commenting, and we have got a lot of regular commenters, we've got V8 Man and a few others who keep popping up saying hello and giving some feedback on the different styles of editing and the different styles of video, and also the jobs that we're working on as well. And we do appreciate all the likes, all the comments, all the shares and the subscribes and everything from you guys. So I hope you have enjoyed this video, and I'll catch you again soon when we get part 3, when we're going to start throwing some gloss down on this shell.